Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. One of those, sneaky games that I don't think enough people are talking about early in the college football season. Boise State going on the road, playing the Oregon Ducks week 2. I think this is a massive game in the college football landscape. You look at it for Boise State, this is, at least in my opinion, the only game that they probably lose on their schedule in 2024. And if Boise State can go on the road to Oregon and kind of show that they can be competitive with what I think is one of the best teams in the country in the Oregon Ducks, you come to Selection Sunday when Boise State's in that conversation of making it into the college football playoffs. I think a lot of people in the college football playoff committee will look at that game and kind of decide if Boise State is deserving of that group of 5 bid. And then you look at the Oregon Ducks. This is one of those games that, again, when you're going to the resume and starting seeding these teams in the college football playoffs, Boise State, you might look up and say, that's a top 20 win for the Oregon Ducks, week 2 of the college football season. I am really excited about this game. I think it has bigger implications than a lot of people realize. And I'm a really big fan of this Boise State team. Now, I've been very vocal that I think this Oregon program is one of the best teams in the country, a bona fide national championship contender. This Boise State team personally would be my pick to make the college football playoffs as that group of 5 program. Really like what they have on offense, maybe some question marks on defense, but do return a ton of production. Want to get into some of these matchups that we will see before we do. And as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. And as college football kind of gets closer, these game predictions, these game previews are some of my favorite things to do. The amount of support y'all have shown all off season, it means the world. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into this one. Let's start with Boise State again. I think a fascinating team that has legitimate difference makers on the offensive side of the football. Now, let's start at the quarterback position, where I'll kind of say this. When I saw Malachi Nelson transfer to Boise State, I thought he was going to be the bona fide quarterback 1 for Boise State heading into 2024. And although that might be still true, yeah, it sounds like Maddox Madsen, from what I've been reading within Boise State's fall camp, is seriously making a push at quarterback 1 and might even be the favorite to start at quarterback. So I think any way you cut it, you probably get better, more consistent quarterback play than what you had with Taylor Green last year, where Taylor Green would have these games that, again, kind of make your jaw drop, but it seemed like it was a different Taylor Green every single week for Boise State on Saturdays. If Maddox Madsen beats out Malachi Nelson, who was one of my favorite quarterback prospects in the 2023 class, I think if you're a Boise State fan, you feel pretty good about what the quarterback position is going to be in 2024. And then you look at what I think might be, he's going to be a top 5 running back, at least in my mind, in the country in 2024. That's Ashton Jeanty. And when you have the conversation around Ashton Jeanty, why I think he's such a valuable member of Boise State. Not only is he a phenomenal ball carrier, had over 1,300 yards last year, over 6 yards per carry. He also had almost 600 receiving yards. And I really did appreciate how Boise State ran that offense last year, where it was it kind of simplified the sport of college football and said, hey, Ashton Jeanty is our best player on our roster by far, specifically on offense. And we're going to run our offense through Ashton Jeanty. And so there were so many different creative ways in terms of how Boise State got the football into Ashton Jeanty's hands. Whenever Ashton Jeanty had the football in his hand, good things were happening for Boise State. This kid is a legitimate difference maker for Boise State. Then you look at the wide receiver spot and you return some guy, you lose some guys like McAllister, who I think were really good for Boise State last year. You bring in a JUCO transfer by the name of Chris Marshall, who again was one of my favorite wide receivers in that 2022 class. Chris Marshall can play from a pure talent standpoint. I've already been seeing some clips about what he's been doing at Boise State in fall camp. Not enough people are talking about some real difference makers for Boise State on the offensive side of the football. Malachi Nelson, Ashton Jeanty, Chris Marshall. These are Power 5, top-end Power 5 players that are on this Boise State roster, which I think makes this Boise State team really exciting. And you look at the offense, they were really good on offense last year, specifically running the football, but averaged 6.5 yards per play. That was 11th in the country. They averaged 5.5 yards per rush. That was 7th in the country. They ran the football a lot. I think Boise State might be a little bit more two-dimensional this year on offense than they were in 2023 because, again, Taylor Green's inconsistencies in that passing attack, were pretty stark. And so if they can kind of take that step in terms of pushing the ball down the field with potentially Malachi Nelson, with Chris Marshall on the outside, this Boise State offense can be dangerous. Now, the big question mark that I have for Boise State's offense going up against Oregon is specifically along the line of scrimmage where, and Boise State fans who are listening to this, I would love to hear y'all opinions on this take. Boise State's offensive line, you go back and look at the numbers, they were really good in the Mountain West. I mean, it was probably one of the better offensive line units that you saw in the conference, specifically running the football. That being said, when you saw them play a team like Washington early in the season in 2023, the pass protection against some of those elite defensive linemen that Washington had, that's when you started having some questions about Boise State. So my biggest question mark about Boise State on the offensive side of the football is really has nothing to do with their difference makers. I think they have some difference makers that could potentially give Oregon some problems. Now, Oregon's got some really good cornerbacks that I think can match up with guys like Chris Marshall, but at the end of the day, they have some guys that can make some plays. My biggest concern is I think this Oregon defensive line took a massive step in the right direction from 2023, whether it was young talent that's getting better heading into 2024, whether it's new faces coming into this program. Can Boise State's offensive line match up against Oregon's defensive line a little bit better than what we saw them match up against Washington's defensive line back early in 2023? Again, I think this offensive line is really good in the Mountain West Conference. This Oregon front seven is not going to be a Mountain West caliber front seven. And so what does that matchup look like? That's my biggest question mark. Now you flip to the other side of the football. Boise State they return a lot of production on defense, and that's something good, right? We see defenses consistently get better as guys get a little bit more, a little bit more gel, a little bit more chemistry. That being said, Boise State's defense was not very good last year, even in the Mountain West, right? 6.1 yards per play. That was 106 in the country. They struggled both stopping the run and the pass. And, why I think that's such a difficult matchup for Oregon. One of the things I love about Oregon's offense, even going back to 2023, is how complete they were, how dynamic they were, how two-dimensional they were, right? Oregon was top 5 in the country at 9.4 yards per pass. Guys like Tez Johnson and Troy Franklin were really, really good in 2023. They're going to be just as good, if not better, in the wide receiver room this year. And so this Oregon passing attack with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback, I still think it's going to be one of the better passing attacks that we see in the country, which, again, was a weakness of Boise State in 2023. But then you look at Oregon running the football and say this offensive line is really good. It's got 2 tackles that I think go first round in the NFL draft, a slew of running backs headlined by Jordan James that I think are going to be really good. Boise State struggled to stop the run too, and that's what makes this Oregon offense so hard to deal with if you're specifically Boise State. If you want to stop Oregon from running the football, walk some safeties into the box, maybe put a little bit of a loaded front seven, loaded box. I don't know if Boise State can match up with the wide receivers that Oregon has on the outside. And if Boise State wants to prevent the big play, I feel like Oregon will just be able to have a lot of success running the football, keeping the ball out of Boise State's offense. And so my biggest concern for Boise State is even if you are able to put up some points against this Oregon defense that I think, again, gets significantly better from 2023, are you going to be able to stop Oregon enough to make this game tight in the third and fourth quarter? That's the biggest question mark. Now, again, if you're a Boise State fan, you're saying, hey, we return pretty much, not everybody, but a good chunk of what this defense was last year. I really do like Spencer Danielson. I think he is a guy that has galvanized this Boise State roster. I think he's going to lead Boise State to a very successful next couple of years. At the end of the day, you look at the talent of both of these teams and say, Oregon is such a complete team that has talent everywhere on the roster, where Boise State has some really good talent. Guys like Chris Marshall, guys like Ashton Genty. Do they have enough talent to compete with Oregon in every aspect of this football game? That's probably the question that you would have. Now, there's no line on this game yet. I would take Oregon to win this football game. And I think the really exciting conversation is, what does this football game look like? Because, again, if you're Boise State, you're saying, if we lose to Oregon, but we show we can compete with the team that, again, I think is one of the best teams in the country heading into 2024, it comes down to early December when we're deciding what group of 5 team gets into the playoffs. You might have an undefeated Liberty and a Boise State team that only has 1 loss. But if that loss against Oregon in Autzen Stadium is a game where you're competitive in, you kind of show that you might be able to bang with some of these top teams in the Power 5 level, I think Boise State probably gets the nod in the Group of Five conference bid to the college football playoffs. And then if you're Oregon, I think this is a really big test. I don't think this, and Dan Lanning, I certainly do not expect him to overlook this Boise State team. This is an opportunity for Oregon to go up against a really good football team and say, all right, let's make sure everybody's kind of coming together as we head into matchups like Ohio State. I expect Oregon to win this game, but I'm going to have a lot of eyeballs on this game in terms of how does Boise State look against a top team in the country? And then for Oregon, how does Oregon, with a lot of new faces coming into this roster, look against a Boise State team that I think beats a lot of Power 5 programs in the country in 2024? Taking the Oregon Ducks, and we'll dive into this game a little bit more as it comes closer, but I think this is a fascinating game. Week 2 of the college football season. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.